Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us in our artists conversation series that we've been having for our current exhibition, Thoughts and Prayers, Another Round of Vacant Stares, on view now through September 19th, both virtually on arthustle.net and at our physical location in Shishama, Madawan. Today we're here talking with Leslie Ann Condon. She is featured in our online exhibition only, and we are happy to have her here. Hello, Leslie.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So I'm just going to introduce Leslie very quickly. Leslie Ann Condon is a Boston area visual artist and emerging arts scholar. Her artwork explores the intersections between visual culture, social ritual, and global consumer culture. As a scholar, Leslie is interested in critical race art history and issues of representation in the arts. Her recent work addresses the complexity of identity within immigrant communities of color, as well as rituals of mourning. Leslie graduated from the University of New Hampshire in 2004 with a minor in fine arts. She attended the School of the Museum of Fine Arts as a diploma student and earned her post-baccalaureate in Fine Art 3D from Massachusetts College of Art and Design in 2011. So, Leslie, I've never really had like a full-on conversation with someone with a background in arts scholarship, so I'm really excited about that.
Well, emerging is probably the key term. I've been taking courses for the last 2 years with the intention of going back for an advanced degree in art history. And so COVID has sort of derailed that process a bit just because it's this question of sustainability in regard to colleges right now. Obviously, they're very vulnerable economically. And also just museum spaces. A lot of museums, unfortunately, are closing, as well as galleries. But yes, I've been interested in that coming from a scholarly perspective versus an artist perspective for a long time, because there's a lot of history and social and political kind of influences and factors that come into the arts. And as an artist, I considered myself a socially engaged artist. And so I'm really thinking about a lot of the things that might be invisible to a lot of other artists and makers. And that is not to say that making art without considering those factors is not of merit, but I do think that there's also a privilege to not acknowledge the positions and the perspectives that we're coming from, especially when those perspectives are privileged, often in invisible ways.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's one of those things that I feel like it is really coming to a head now, that like maybe 5-10 years ago, that just wasn't a discussion or topic or consideration. And I felt like we all knew it was there, but I guess we didn't know how to address it. And, I think it's important work really focusing in on, these museums and universities. And honestly, like the fact that coronavirus has happened is really, I think, going to be forcing these places to really look at themselves inward and about the way they represent other groups of people, that haven't typically been represented by them previously.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing I'm definitely excited about is that these conversations are definitely moving to the forefront, but at the same time, I also want to emphasize to people that this scholarship has been in place and created by Black and Brown scholars, especially Black women scholars, for decades. So Angela Davis, Audre Lorde was bringing this critical lens to this kind of to creative expression and breaking it down for people. And I don't think it's gotten the visibility that it has deserved until more recent, because of these recent conversations that are suddenly coming to light. And so we're all collectively trying to gain further competency about how to talk about race and race studies. And so this conversation is very new for a lot of people, but I'm grateful, despite all of the challenges that are kind of coming to a head. I'm glad that there's at least some dialogue that is just pushing this topic further, this discussion further.
Yeah.
It's just so crucial.
Yeah, and I think it really is difficult to talk about it. I know as a white woman, I find myself very, sometimes I don't know if I have the right words, or not only that, but whether it's my place to be in the conversation. And so it's hard to have those conversations, and it's hard to engage in those conversations with people outside of your own personal demographics too, because I know for me personally, I always wonder, one, am I saying the right thing? Two, am I just, should I be saying anything? Should I just be sitting and listening? I don't want to be, like, my voice has been heard so many times over and over again in these conversations. Like I should probably just be sitting and listening at this point. But it's hard.
Yeah, and you're not alone in that feeling and sentiment. I think there's a lot of anxiety around how to say the right thing and do the right thing. And I think the most important thing is to what you've already said, is to listen. Really listen in an active way. Don't listen to react. And also approach the conversation as a student, as a questioning. And I think that's the problem, is that there's a lot of people that are coming into this space that are new, that are they're phrasing their words and terminologies in a way of like, well, this is what I feel. And that's always valid, but sometimes it should be more like, well, this is what I'm thinking. Is this right? This is what I'm feeling. This is what I've observed. Is there problems with that? And I think there's a difference to that, right? There's like being kind of firm and polarized in our position, rather than having some fluidity and ability to be flexible and to be more humble and open to what's coming in. And I certainly still do that, because I'm still learning how to be an ally to other Black and Brown communities. And so I'm always trying to take the stance of listening and educating myself, taking a lot of time to read, a lot of time to listen to talks and speeches by other leaders in other communities. So watching television shows that are centered on those voices, so that I'm not forcing my friends to do all the work and educate me. But the most important thing is, if someone does say something, I'm listening and not getting defensive and being like, okay, I need to pivot, I need to adjust, or I need to at least think about it. And I think that is probably the biggest distinction, that some people do come in their defenses rise. And that's probably the most painful thing for people of color, Black and Brown people, because we're already swimming through this soup of violence, and that's showing up in so many different ways. Having conversations with friends, you can feel physically violated at this point, just because what people are saying, even on a subconscious level, is saying like, my body, my livelihood does not matter. And that is hitting us in our bodies on a biological level, which cannot be felt by, unfortunately, it cannot be felt by white people, because they don't have to endure that all the time. So one of the metaphors that I use is that it feels right now like, when I talk to my white friends, that we're walking down the street and they're just walking, and I'm on a treadmill, and I'm like jogging or running while they're just walking. And so I'm like, running around things, like dodging trees, running around rocks or something, while they're just kind of strolling and then taking in the scenery and like living their life. Well, I'm trying to like, battle lions, something like that. So there's just so many other things that we're navigating, and it's really hard when allies cannot take more ownership over their own education and just take the time to reflect rather than to respond.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what, that's exactly what I've been finding myself, the correct, what feels like the correct response. And I just don't understand how other people don't see that too. There isn't this invisibility factor that you've been mentioning, but I feel like it's so visible, and
Sorry,
I
my
don't.
nose is running.
That's okay. I don't understand. I have a hard time understanding where other people aren't seeing what you see and what I see. And go ahead.
Yeah. Oh no, I was going to say that it does really, there are instances where it really is invisible, the way that racism shows up. And so I understand that, but I think it's when we start pushing back and saying like, no, 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 like we do need to talk about this, is when it becomes, the tension and conflict arise. You know, I'm trying to give more space and be more compassionate to the people that don't have any sort of high cultural competency, because, you know, we've been essentially groomed as a society to not see those things. And so it's not completely on on everybody that we don't see those things, and we have to kind of break it down and break it apart and analyze it. But at the same time, when we do, that's and people push back, that's the hard part. And I understand, because it's like someone, not myself, but another scholar, compared it to the Matrix, where it's like, do you take the pill, or do you take I forget what color pill, the blue pill or the red pill? Like, do you really want to see what's happening, or do you want to live in your little bubble, ignorant, bubble of ignorance that is, again, we're groomed to accept openly. So yeah, it is, on the one hand, I definitely agree. Like, sometimes I don't understand, but at the same time, I can see that, the patriarchy, the forces that control our society have been very effective in dividing people, especially Black and brown people, from each other. So it only makes sense that we need more time to come to this place of collective understanding, but it's just, it's incredibly painful in the meantime. And I just think that people will have to, or, allies to Black and brown people will have to be a little bit harder on themselves, and just be a little bit more committed. I was just reading how the situation, the murder of George Floyd, has only caused 39% of the country to do more in regard to racial justice. And that's a really small percentage. Hopefully that means that there's people that were already doing the work prior to that. But I just, I think that's what the issue is, that people are totally stirred up and they're thinking, but is their thinking really amounting to systemic change?
Yeah. And I'm speaking of George Floyd and the recent shooting in Wisconsin as well. I'm learning and hearing that as a result of this, people who were thinking, who had voted for Donald Trump and then were thinking of not voting for him this time, it's revved them back up towards him again. It's stoking up white fear and with all of the rhetoric that's coming from that. And I just, again, it's this division and violence that I find it very difficult to know that this works on some people, and it's hard. And that's one of the reasons why this exhibition came to fruition, is this this never-ending cycle of violence that I just don't. It's hard to know, and it's hard to, I guess, be able. This is one of the things in all of the conversations I've been having with the artists, is trying to figure out a way to have empathy and to stop, quote unquote, dehumanizing the other side, and figuring out a way to just have conversations that are useful again, and figure out ways that we can come together and not divide again anymore.
Yeah, I'm absolutely appreciative of this exhibition. It's an incredibly timely show to be discussing all of these issues. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that some of these you know, Donald, I don't even want to say his name, our current administration, you know, they're just taking advantage of the social climate that has already been in the works for decades. Like, this isn't new. This has been like a strategic plan from, you know, conservative right for a very long time. So they've been stoking this fire since the 70s, since the time that they saw that the protest of the 70s, the activism of Black and brown scholars was actually causing social change, right? We had incredible breakthroughs in regard to human rights, social progress. And they saw that and they said, you know, we need to ensure that this never happens again. So one of those things was, of course, we know Fox News. They found an outlet that will just perpetuate their propaganda. And that is obviously, you know, an element or a tool of the fascist state, which is terrifying. But that is, all of these things have been in place since the 1970s. So it's not a surprise that someone like Donald Trump rose to power. I meant to not say his name, but it came up. But, you know, so it's, of course we can blame him, but we also need to see all of the factors in play that kind of, you know, set the stage for all of this, all of the, you know, and that's not to even say that it's only on the conservative side. Of course, we've had a lot of things happening on the left, which has allowed corporations to really, you know, erode a lot of our infrastructure that allows them to control, you know, act in ways that they've never been able to act before. And that has been a little bit on the left, where we've given them that power to act in ways that are, you know, purely for profit, purely about maintaining a capitalist system, versus trying to obviously help our society, our communities, our citizens. So, you know, these economic disparities have already been in play for so long, and they were very intentional. And so it left this space for someone to come in and pretend to be for the little people, which of course he's not. And that's probably the most twisted thing, but people are, I think people were so beaten down that they were ready to align themselves with someone, even if they knew that, you know, on a subconscious level, that he probably wasn't going to bring the economic change. At least he would address the racial, you know, shift in our demographics, which I think, you know, as you were saying, is bringing a lot of people, bringing up feelings of fear and defensiveness. And so at least he's addressing that for them. And obviously for some, that's enough, which is obviously terrifying and heartbreaking. And how do you heal a country? But I don't think it's anything that will happen anytime soon. I think this will be a generational thing, where it will be decades until we can kind of come to a place of greater peace and equity, because you know, the process has been decades in the making. The healing from it will also be decades in the making.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's so many people being so affected by like a multifaceted approach from these policies, from what's happening at the border to what's happening with the amount of violence that's occurring right now, and the economic disparities, and the crisis with COVID, and we don't even know what that's going to look like at the end. And yeah, so it's going to be a long road. I agree with you, but I'm really hoping that there is a healing process, and we figure out a way to heal and to work with one another to create more positive change. But I would like to share your piece that's in the exhibition.
Sure.
And this is titled Bullet Points. I'm going to pull it up. Can you see that?
Yep.
And it's the full screen?
Yeah, nearly.
Okay. I can also zoom in and out. So Leslie, would you like to talk about this piece?
Sure. So as we've already talked about, I'm an emerging scholar, so I'm thinking a lot about some of the national conversation in regard to the ways that we're creating artwork around police brutality in protests. So there's a lot of conversation and controversy around the use of Black bodies, brown bodies. People have often called it trauma porn, where you're just using the bodies of Black and brown people to be props to talk about police brutality, which is a further traumatization for those communities, our communities. And so I was really like, I don't feel like it's my place to create a piece like for Breonna Taylor that's about making her look like a saint, right? And then there's also politics around that. When you make someone a saint, you're still making them otherworldly, right? You're making them somebody, you know, on a higher plane, but you're still not making them just like a human person, which is what Black and brown people want to be seen as. We're just people, and we're trying to live our lives. We're trying to achieve our dreams, which is just, you know, having happy home lives, careers. So I was really looking to create imagery that was not utilizing anybody's, non-figurative. The Black mass in the back, in the distance, is supposed to represent that abstract othering. So that could be, you know, a protest of people. That could be a country in a different, you know, a different country that we're having some kind of foreign policy issue with. And so I looked up different, I don't usually work in digital illustration. You might be able to tell, audience members, because it's not quite as sophisticated as some of my other work. But I wanted to create a work that utilized a lot of different bullets to just talk about the ways that, trying to draw connections between the way that we enact police sanctions or police brutality in the way that we, that foreign policy is shaped. And so both of those issues are, those issues kind of stem from similar places where we're really trying to control something. We're trying to control the narrative of our place right now in the country, right? There's a lot of police departments that are trying to say, like, you know, this person was acting in ways that I had to just use, you know, deadly force to diffuse the situation. And that's coming to a head right now as we see the way that media really is being used as propaganda, right? There's this comparison to the way we're talking about using words in spoken language to talk about someone like Dylan Roof, than we are to talk about, you know, a Black man that has done, you know, something even more benign, like selling loose cigarettes, you know, like that is, you know, we're starting to see that the way not only the language that we use, but the visuals that we use. So the way that what headshots do we use, what portrait pictures are being put into the newspaper that tell us, like, is this person worthy of my compassion? Is this person not worthy? So I brought language into this particular piece because I wanted to bring that conversation into my work without, again, bringing in the actual bodies of Black and brown people. And so each of the bullets, they're bullet casings. So technically, if they were in flight, the bullet shells would have fell off. But if you saw them without that, you wouldn't, the picture wouldn't make sense to people. And so each bullet is, one is, I forget, I'm not well versed in bullets, but two of them, the ones that speak about democracy, are both the kind that are used by the US and the UN overseas. So when we're in spaces like Venezuela, some of our past conflict in Southeast Asia, we've used, sorry, similar, the same or similar bullets to, again, try to control the crowds in those spaces. And so I'm really, you know, again, trying to talk about the way that we're dictating narratives in regard to what's happening overseas. You know, a lot of people still believe, like, oh, the US is going over there because they really are trying to protect people and instill democracy. But if we look at some place like Syria, it's like, what are we doing? Like, what, like, how we still have this thing where we think we are like the parent of the world, that we need to dictate like what is happening in foreign countries and how it's happening and the way that government is being shaped there. And if you really dig deep, you don't even have to dig that deep. Most of those spaces, like most of our intentions are fueled by capitalism. You know, it's
Yeah.
like of what is in it for us, like what kind of arms can they provide, what if they're an ally in the region, what can we, how can they serve us in regard to being like an outpost for our military, something like that. And so there's so many like nefarious reasons, which always comes down to capitalism.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily ever really about necessarily protecting their citizens overseas or helping the citizens there. It's
Right.
yeah.
It's usually never really.
Yeah.
And so one prime example that I use is I'm Lao, and so my family is from Laos, and they were there. My parents were there, living, you know, as people during the Vietnam War. And so during the Vietnam War, there was a secret war in Laos where they were bombing the crap out of it, and there's bombs all over Laos still. And that is something that there's been more discussion over the last few years about that, but that's like a hidden history of the United States where the CIA was in there doing a bunch of things, and but under the context or narrative of helping the people. And it's like, well, how did you help the people when you left thousands and thousands of bombs that are still active, that farmers, children, people that are just building a house come upon, and it blows up half their body, takes off. And it's like, how do we, you know, like, how do we continue to stand by that narrative when we've decimated a country? Like, I can't even imagine that happening to the United States and allowing, and then, you know, if Russia had done that, and then they have the gall to tell us and to tell the world that it was on our behalf, right? And there's people, you know, decades later being blown to pieces because of their, you know, military force. But that
because they couldn't be bothered to clean up their own mess.
Right. And then other things like the Agent Orange that they utilized during the Vietnam War that caused cancer and birth defects, and that are hurting both the Vietnamese and Lao people, but also U.S. veterans. So
Yes.
it's like, you know, this whole context and this part of the story that's just not acknowledged, and, you know, they try to wipe it out from our history books. But, you know, with the internet, there is more of a rise of different narratives that come up and more honest accounts of, you know, what really happened, which is crucial. So in addition to those bullets, there's several ones that are from that are used by police in the US. So those ones say things, they say, "I'm not a racist, I was afraid for my life." So thinking about, again, the ways that newspapers and the media talk about these shootings, but also the words that people use to justify these shootings. That is in addition to the rubber bullet, which is on the bottom left, which says "protest must remain peaceful." And so, you know, rubber bullets is a whole other thing. Of course, we have what's going on in Portland, Oregon right now, where rubber bullets are actually quite deadly. They can still kill people. They can blind you. It's if you've seen pictures on the internet, they're actually, the injuries from rubber bullets are very horrific. And so, you know, there's this idea, it's just so interesting seeing the conversation around protests, because obviously it's very polarizing right now. But if you were to go, you know, if someone were to watch the news in French, you know, French news, like protests in France are like a national pastime where they go all out And it's this embraced part of their national heritage that you can protest, you can burn the streets down. And the government, you know, for the most part, understands that. But here, any sort of protest, especially in regard to something that is completely crucial to talk about, especially, you know, police brutality and murdering, we're instantly, you know, defensive, you know, as
Yeah.
a country. Like, we don't want to talk about it. Like, this shouldn't happen. There's a lot of respectability politics, meaning that people are like, well, we can protest, but it should always be peaceful. It should always
Yeah.
be this and that. And that is, again, another problematic layer. So even though the visuals of this piece are very simplistic, there's a lot of things I'm trying to bring into the piece, or at least referencing, that I think complicate the content of the work. And I hope that people will sit with it and read it, and it'll just make them think. And you can definitely, I think, view and absorb the work on a very like low superficial level, which is totally valid. But I do hope that some people take away a more in-depth reading of it to see what I'm trying to do in regard to looking at narratives and the way that they inform the way that we think about history and inform current events, especially in regard to state-sanctioned action, you know, both in the country and abroad.
Well, you know what I absolutely love about your piece is exactly what you said, is that it's very simply designed, but it speaks so straightforward to the point of what you're looking to convey, and it speaks volumes just by this design that's so straightforward. And that's actually one of the reasons why I chose this piece. And I appreciated the more abstract viewing and not using the sensationalism of using, you know, figurative bodies in the work, and just focusing in on the words and what they mean, and the, you know, the bullets. I feel it speaks volumes, and exactly what you said about the piece is what is shown, I feel.
Yeah, thank you. I was really excited to have this work accepted, because it's one of the first works I've made in solidarity with other Black and Brown communities. Because again, I've been thinking about how I specifically want to make imagery that is speaking to these issues, because it is so sensitive and so complex.
Very easily made such a complex issue so translatable and easy to see and understand in that work. And I did look on your website to see your other work, which looks so completely different from that one particular piece.
Yeah, that's so true.
Can you talk about the differences between, I guess, why you chose to make that piece so different from where you usually come from in your work?
Yeah, I think, well, I thought about making such a work by drawing it. I'm a trained fine artist, so I'm used to using my hands and my body to make work. But I've been just doing more digital illustration work because of COVID, partly because I have an autoimmune disease, so it kind of makes the physical process of making work sometimes tough. And also I've been working on some sculptural pieces that actually require a great deal of physical rigor. So I just wanted to give my body like a time to rest. But in addition, I've just been really responding to all of the graphic work that's coming out. Certainly some amazing digital illustrations being done by more artists that are trained in that medium, which I've been completely inspired by. Just beautiful, nuanced, you know, protest posters, graphic novels, things like that. And so I just have been playing with it for the last few months, mocking up like posters and things like that. And so when this came up, I started to draw it, but then realized that by using the digital illustration, I could more easily, well, from like a perspective point of view, just the complicated perspective of the different bullets, I realized I could actually have more control over their accuracy, just because, you know, again, like the many bullets going into that that focal point really requires some angles that are thoughtful. And I could have drew it in again by hand, but I just didn't think the text would look as nicely done. You know, if I was a trained illustrator, I probably would have hand drawn the piece to allow for like that kind of illusion of being carved, the letters being carved into the side of the bullet. And that's not to say that someone that's trained couldn't do it even in a more beautiful and nuanced way than me. But I just decided to shift that way just because, again, I'm really interested in the ways that digital illustration is being utilized right now. And also just in terms of like the poster. So allowing the piece to be printed. When I gave the 36 by 36, I actually printed it out, but didn't realize how large it would be. So if other people want the poster, I would probably print it out smaller because it is quite large to have on your wall. But that was another thing, is that I wanted there to be duplicates that weren't necessarily just like scanned copies, to allow for that really strong black and white to come through.
Yeah.
So yeah, it wasn't a completely, you know, the deepest process, but something that I'm trying to become more skilled in, just because I can see how powerful it is to make work like that. And again, because of that, I think it just like sharing through social media is a little bit easier. I think there's the digital graphic just pops more.
Yeah.
And that's probably more important to me for this particular piece, because I'm really thinking about how I want such work to be shared, you know, if it helps to facilitate dialogues like this.
Well, it's interesting that you refer to it as a poster, because I very much see that in terms that posters so easily communicate so much with so little, with so little. You know, if you think about, you know, protest signs, or even more simply movie posters, or you know, things like that. There's just so much information just from just so little visual and text, and that's exactly what your work does. So you've achieved that. So
well, thank you. And I have so much more, like even more respect for artists and graphic designers that do that day in, day out, because it's a lot of thought, you know, goes into that process.
Yeah. So we were talking in the beginning about your scholarly background and your research background, and I know you're also you're curating a project right now. Would you like to talk more about that?
Sure. So that work is fully curated, and the project is called New Narratives: Reclaiming Asian Identity Through Story. And so that was in partnership with Unbound Visual Arts in Boston. And that includes both a virtual exhibition that is coming down on September 8th, in case people want to check it out, and also a storyteller series, which will be archived on Brain Arts blog and also the Unbound Visual Arts blog. I'll have to see exactly where on the visual arts, the Unbound Visual Arts blog, because they're kind of shifting their blog around. So it's like a two-part project, which I hope continues, because we were initially hoping for in-person exhibitions like everybody else during this time. It's like that question. And so the opening reception also included an open mic, and we also had a discussion roundtable with our artists and our storytellers at different times. And so that was inspired initially by a piece I was working on for another show that was about my specific identity as a Southeast Asian first generation daughter to people that fled Lao.
Mm.
Um, but so when I first came to Unbound Visual Arts, I actually was thinking of creating a project that included immigrants more broadly, especially immigrants that were being impacted by the current travel bans, the deportation issues that have been enacted, or the deportation orders rather.
Mm.
But then with the emergence of COVID and the associated anti-Asian rhetoric that came up, I really felt like I needed to kind of hone down and give, create something that allowed Asian Americans, especially from the Boston area, to just, celebrate and to be empowered by a creative expression. And so that has been a very exciting project to work on for the last, I guess maybe like 6 months or so.
Oh, wow.
And the exhibition includes 40 artworks from 25 different artists. And then we have about, I think, 7 or 8 different storytellers that have written and spoken stories that are included in the blog. And so that goes back, this idea about narratives goes back to what we've been talking about in the past, before, just in regard to the fact that there's always been a lot of control over narratives.
Mm-hmm.
And that is especially true for Black and Brown people in regards to our stories and our histories. And we've always told those stories. We've always had things that explains aspects of our culture to us and help shape our cultural perspective, but we haven't always, our narratives haven't always been at the forefront when someone outside our communities wants to learn about us, or, in an academic setting, certainly, it's not always us that are driving that language and that narrative. And that really is so deeply problematic for so many different reasons. And one of those reasons is that because, imagine having your own cultural heritage and having, I don't know what yours is, but let's say someone from France has, someone from Mexico tell their stories, but that is the story. Like, that's another thing that we establish, or our society tries to say, is that there's only like one narrative. So imagine having your country's stories being told by someone outside that country, and it's the narrative, this monolithic story that's told, that's supposed to be sweeping, encapsulating story about, how your country was formed, the society, and what your country finds meaningful in that society. And obviously, if, you can understand how that would be problematic, that is even more problematic to Black and Brown people, because that is an extension of colonialism and imperialism. That's controlling how we see ourselves, and how others see us. And in those storytellings, there's always, of course, again, that the agenda, like what is the agenda behind how you tell those stories? It's being told by the colonists, the settlers, then it's going to be, told in a way that in service to them in that society, not to our society. And it's also going to reduce the way that we're being seen. Our stories are going to be flattened. We're going to become these stereotyped, two-dimensional people, or these props, versus having our stories be told in these nuanced, complicated, multi-voiced ways. There's not just one story. There's a million different stories, and those stories really need to be uplifted, and they need to come from our communities. And unfortunately, I think this is, another example of invisible racism, where people don't see, they don't understand that is so problematic. We kind of see a little bit in regard to the fact that there's a lot of Southern states that refuse to acknowledge slavery in their history books. It's like, imagine that, like, and that growing up, I just remember we constantly read about slavery and the Holocaust. But imagine going to a school where you didn't hear those things, and how deeply problematic that is. So again, like, that's a a very prominent example of the importance of having narratives be told by multiple people, especially from the communities most impacted by those narratives.
Oh, absolutely. I've been actually really rethinking back to my own childhood and grade school experience and even high school experience, and what we were being taught in our history books. And I feel, and it's one of those things that I guess like you don't think too hard on until like you go back and actually think like what did they actually try teach me back in grade school. Everything's a little fuzzy in general, right? And I really did realize that the things they really focused in on was just the Revolutionary War and World War II, and I realized that everything else was just kind of like glanced over in between. And we only did get, these perspectives of white men and, white women here and there. And we didn't, there was absolutely no perspective from any other group of people. And it was never brought up in classroom discussions or any of that. I grew up in a mostly white community, and it's one of those things where unless you're trying to look back and like be introspective, I guess a lot of people aren't going to, I guess, think about how wrong that is necessarily.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, another really prominent example of that is the focus on Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
He's obviously a great, great man, and he did amazing work. But there's so many other activists, and especially, it's important to write to create visibility around the people that did things locally. So it's like, why isn't there more discussion around Frederick Douglass? Some, other activists that were doing amazing things. And so, of course, we should be uplifting Martin Luther King, but we also have other people to focus on too. In addition to his narrative, we always, paint him as like this gentle patron saint, right? And we're like misremembering how hated he was, how attacked he was. That's why he was assassinated, right? And so, again, like his narrative has been so whitewashed, and so that he's remembered in this way that's deeply inaccurate to the man he was. He'd be the person that's marching the streets today.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Maybe burning the streets down, and that is something we need to keep in mind and always remember. Like, these people did not come in, and it was not like tea time. It was incredibly confrontational, violent moment for a lot of different activists, and all of those activists need to be remembered, and especially the ones that are more local, because I think the work they were doing fits more accurately into the context of the local politics of that time.
Yeah,
which
for
helps
sure.
Yeah, so it's like less abstract and more specific, and we can connect the dots a little bit more easily to the specific issues of that time in regard to our specific areas of the country.
Yeah, I think a lot of it also comes down to education as a whole. I grew up, and I know a lot of people I know grew up just assuming what I'm being taught in school is what's true and what's right, right? I mean, you don't really question those things until you're older, and some people never do. And so you have and the people teaching you, they grew up learning that as well. It's a whole system, right? So they don't think they're teaching you something wrong. They think that they're teaching you what's right, and that's the real history, and it goes on and on and on until someone questions and maybe is like, oh, wait a minute.
No, absolutely. And that's why, I've been thinking about going back to school just so I can, be one of those educators. But like across the board, we have to have more Black and brown educators in the classrooms, because we need to have, you know, to have these people that are questioning and thinking. And that's not to say that there are non-Black and brown people that are not questioning. There certainly are, and that every Black and brown person questions. There's certainly people that might not be questioning, but there's more capacity and potential for that questioning and that challenging of the status quo when there's more Black and brown scholars, educators, intellects in those educational spaces. Sorry. And that is probably one of the biggest things that we can do to shift our country culturally. Ideology, you know, the ideology is to allow for different academics of different perspectives to emerge and to be able to safely come into a space and share their work. Because again, the scholars can be there, but right now it's not always safe. There's a lot of pushbacks. So
and that's another thing I would have never considered as a safety aspect to the whole process.
Yeah. So it's, you know, in safety in regards to a lot of different levels, like in safety in regard to like having supervisors support you, to having students respect you and not try to sabotage you, to have your committee promote you to be identified as someone worth cultivating, to be able to say something that is potentially controversial to that institute, but not controversial in regards to talks of like progress. And then, you know, the other layer of threat, which again is, you know, people actively targeting scholars and intellects to try to frighten them into not speaking their truth. And there's been intellects that have chosen to not talk, to not take part in panel talks, in discussions and presentations because of the real threats to their safety. And I don't think people realize that's you know, where we've come to as a country, and how terrifying, and the implications of that in the larger scope of things is just incredibly frightening.
Yeah, it really is. I feel like I could talk to you all day. You just have so much good meaty stuff to say and share, and I feel like this has just been such a wonderful conversation that we've had. Is there anything you'd like to share additionally? Projects coming up, or just any last words?
I just had 2 different exhibitions wrap. So you can't see them anymore, unfortunately, but you can go to my website to check out some of the work that was currently exhibited at a few different places, including the Asian Arts Initiative in Philadelphia. And then I guess I'll just share maybe just one artwork, which is more personal in content and relates to the piece that I just shared. Okay, and so I just wanted to share this because this is one of my recent exhibition or installations, and this is more personal in content, but it relates directly to the poster that is featured in Thoughts and Prayers, in that it's referencing my personal history as a first-generation Lao American. Family fled Laos after the Vietnam War. And so through this piece, I'm trying to talk about the ways that I personally was caught in this space between identifying as Southeast Asian, but also American, and the way that I found myself, just erasing my identity, or trying to sometimes, conform to like supposed like American culture and behavior, whatever that means, but kind of rejecting the Asian part of me. And this piece also relates to another piece that I don't have a slide for, unfortunately, but the other piece is also using these name tags. And I'm using both the name tags and little mirrors. And in that piece, I'm talking about how the way that identity is cultivated through visual and visual imagery or visual language, and then written and spoken language. And you know, we use both those visual and written language to understand our identity, and both of them, you know, don't really quite completely encapsulate who we are, or really our identity in some ways, because obviously we don't want to be entirely understood or known through the way we look.
Yeah.
And sometimes words aren't enough. Sometimes it's not, you know, it's not just my name. It's not just the fact that I'm, you know, Lao American. It's beyond that. There's like an essence to us. There's a human quality to all of us. So yes, I just want to share that piece to show that I'm thinking a lot about, you know, U.S. military action abroad and the way that it impacts immigrants, impact, you know, on a intergenerational level, you know, the trauma that we all carry, immigrants, especially immigrants of color, immigrants impacted by war, perpetuated by U.S. military action abroad. And so the piece that in the show for Thoughts and Prayers is starting to create, to draw lines between my experience and the experience of my other Black and Brown citizens and friends. So yeah, that's, I'll leave you with that just because I know we've been talking a long time, but I completely, absolutely appreciate this opportunity to talk with you. And thank you again for putting together this show. This is definitely one of those shows that I so wish that I was able to come and see the work in person, because I know something is lost when you can't engage with the artwork in person. But you've done a great job putting it together and putting together some of the programming, and I'm very excited to tune in to some of the stuff that you have coming up.
Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, I'd just like to remind all of our viewers that Thoughts and Prayers is up until September 19th, both on our website at arthustle.net, where you could see Leslie's work and 28 other artists on the virtual exhibition space, or you could schedule an appointment to the gallery at Shishama Madawan in New Jersey, and I can take you on a tour. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and we will see you soon.